Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the Johnson Space Center. We're here today for our Expedition 43 and the one-year crew mission overview and science briefing. I'm Dan Hewitt. So we're just about 2 months away now from the launch of NASA astronaut Scott Kelly and Russian cosmonauts Mikhail Kornienko and Gennady Padalka. Kelly and Kornienko will be spending a full year on board the station, very important milestone and a new step as we begin our next journeys, getting ready to make giant leaps beyond and eventually on to Mars. So we're going to talk a little bit about what's ahead for the crew for the next year. Joining me here today, I have International Space Station Program Manager Mike Suffredini. I also have Emily Nelson, NASA Flight Director, Julie Robinson, the International Space Station Chief Scientist, and finally Steve Gilmore, NASA Flight Surgeon. So we're going to hear from each of them first, and then we'll go ahead and open it up for everybody's questions. So Mike, why don't you go ahead and start us off?
Well, good morning. It's been quite a while since we announced that we were going to have a one-year increment on board, and so it's good to be in front of all of you discussing it today specifically. Several years, 2 or 3 years ago, we sat down with our Russian colleagues and the rest of the partners and decided it was time to start considering extending our durations on board ISS in order to start to understand the effects of microgravity and other environments in space on the human system as we start to approach exploration beyond low Earth orbit. And at that time, we picked this period to begin our first one-year increment, and the team has been preparing for this ever since. As luck would have it, of course, we also have a number of other things going on board station. So during these 4 increments that will make up the one-year flight for both Scott and Misha, we're also going to be reconfiguring the U.S. segment to have dockings again, and in preparation for the arrival of the first commercial crew vehicle to the International Space Station. So this period will be not only busy from a research standpoint as we do the research that we have been doing for some time on the human subjects for 6 months, but we have the one-year subjects as well that adds to our list of research to do. And of course, the ever-growing commercial use of the International Space Station is also picking up during this period of time. And so in the middle of all this research, we have a major reconfiguration of the International Space Station as we begin to adapt the forward port on Node 2 to have a new docking system, the NASA docking system we call it, and an adapter that we're going to have on station, the International Docking Adapter. So we'll have one on the forward port, and then we'll put one on the zenith port of Node 2. And we will clear the nadir port of Node 1 to have the backup berthing port. So when we're done, we have docking on the forward port, we'll have docking on the zenith port, and we'll have berthing on the Node 2 nadir port and the Node 1 nadir port. Of course, today we have the PMM on Node 1 nadir, and so we have quite a bit of work to do to move the PMM, to run all the cables we need to run for the new docking systems, to prep for the removal of PMA3 from Node 3 port to Node 2 Zenith. And then, of course, the installation of the docking adapters, which today are planned to be brought up on SpaceX 7 and SpaceX 9. So all of this work is going on while the one-year crew's on orbit. So we will keep them very busy, which I think is a good thing as you're spending quite a bit of time on orbit. But at the same time, getting ourselves ready for the first commercial flights to the International Space Station. So in addition to that, I should say, in addition to that, we've been working with the logistics partners to get the vehicle squared away to support ISS for the next year or so. Our orbital friends will start flying back to station hopefully in the October of 2015 timeframe. The SpaceX Corporation, of course, had their first successful launch of the year to the International Space Station. Dragon is there servicing it now, and we have flights lined up for April and the June-July timeframe, and then one at the end of fall, and we're looking to pull up the flight in December up into the November timeframe in order to keep the logistics train going. So that looks very, very good for the program. In addition to that, we also have an HTV flight in the summertime. So from a logistics standpoint, in order to support the research that we plan to do, both the nominal research we have and the one-year increment research, it looks like the logistics will support all that. So that's the plan going forward. This morning, Emily will walk through the ops portion of that, and then Julie will give you quite a bit of rundown on the research aspect of it as well. So with that, I'll hand it over to Emily.
Good morning. First, let me walk through for you the crews that we'll have making up the expeditions of this year-long flight. Over the course of the year, Scott and Mikhail will be a part of 4 separate expeditions. If we can start bringing up those graphics. We'll begin with Terry Virts, Samantha Cristoforetti, and Anton Shkaplerov that are already on orbit today. Scott and Mikhail and Gennady Padalka will be joining them to make up the Expedition 43 crew. When Terry, Samantha, and Anton depart shortly thereafter, we'll move into Expedition 44 with the mission of Kjell Lindgren, Kimya Yui, and Oleg Konyenko, who will be joining them to make up Expedition 44. In order to provide a fresh Soyuz for Kelly Kornienko and Padalka will be having a direct handover for the trade from Expedition 44 to 45. So Sergei Volkov will bring up a Soyuz that will include ESA astronaut Andreas Morgensen and spaceflight participant Sarah Brightman. Then Sergei will stay on board, trading places with Gennady. Gennady will take Andreas and Sarah Brightman back home again, and that will make up your Expedition 45 crew. Then once Kjell and Kimya and Oleg depart, we'll shortly after that have Tim Kopra, Tim Peake, and Yuri Melenchenko come up for Expedition 46. And that will make up the 4 separate expeditions we'll have over the course of the year. Again, as Mike pointed out, over the long duration of this mission, we're going to do quite a bit of not only research, but U.S. systems reconfigurations to make room for docking adapters so that we can start bringing up U.S. crewed vehicles. In order to get those international docking adapters installed, we've got some graphics to show you the reconfigurations that Mike outlined. Here you can see the permanent multipurpose module and where it will be moving from the blue location, where it is nadir of the Node 1 module, out to the forward port of the Node 3 module, freeing up that Node 1 port for cargo vehicles. We'll also continue to berth cargo vehicles at the Node 2 nadir port, so they'll be side by side there. Then we also need to move pressurized mating adapter number 3, again, starting in its location at the port side of Node 3, where it's shown in blue in the graphic, moving it to the zenith portion of Node 2 so that our 2 docking adapters can be side by side there on the zenith and forward portions of Node 2. You can see the white tips of the pressurized mating adapters are the international docking adapters. All of that work requires a great number of spacewalk activities, and currently that's spread across 7 different spacewalks over the next year. 1 of those is complete. We've got 3 more coming up soon and a briefing about those next month. We also have a significant structural science opportunity with the Bigelow Expandable Activity Module coming up on a SpaceX mission this summer. That will be installed on the Node 3 aft port. We have a quick video showing the extraction from the SpaceX vehicle. Then the U.S. robotic arm is going to swing that around to install it on Node 3. It brings with it the gas canisters required for its expansion. So once we get it installed robotically, we'll then be able to ingress that module and deploy the gas from its canisters. And here you'll see we'll wait for the video. Eventually, there we go. And then it'll be our first soft-sided expandable module. It'll be on board for a total of 2 years. Periodically, the crew will go inside to gather data on structural integrity, leak rate, temperature, radiation environment, and all of those kinds of information, which we'll pass back to our Bigelow partners as we progress in new structural technologies for future spaceflight. And with that, we will be doing quite a bit of science over the course of the year, and Julie will walk through a lot of that for us.
Thanks, Emily. We have hundreds and hundreds of investigations going on over the coming year. Really, probably between 400 and 500 investigations will take place. We don't even know how many investigations because we're doing such a rapid turnaround, especially with commercial users getting to ISS, that there are users who will come to ISS this year who have not yet finished designing their experiment. So it's a really exciting, dynamic time for the laboratory. But if I were going to pick a single theme, it's clearly health for exploration and health for life on Earth. And so I want to talk to you. I just picked 6 investigations that really help you understand that context of how the research that we're doing on ISS both helps us make sure that crews will be healthy and ready to go to Mars when we have the systems ready to support that, as well as take that knowledge and bring it back here on Earth to make people's lives better, help them live longer, and help them live with a higher quality of life. So the first area is really working at almost the cellular level, at a basic building block level, and using space to understand how cells respond to gravity, and then helping to then use that to interpret health on Earth. So if I could have my first graphic, I want to explain a little bit of the basics of why we do this in space. So if you look at those 3 little flasks, they represent 3 of the things that don't happen in space that happen on Earth that really matter for cells. In the upper left, one of the things you don't have is convection. So you don't have mixing. Warm things don't rise, cold things don't fall. On the flask on the right, what you see is we have a low shear environment. There's not a lot of waves and mixing like you have in a gravitational environment when you're growing cells. And at the bottom, you see the third flask shows that we don't have sedimentation in space. So heavy particles don't go to the bottom of a fluid like they do here on Earth. And those 3 things dramatically change the way that you culture cells and how those cells respond. In fact, it makes the cells act more like cells in the body and less like cells in a test tube. And then the graphic also represents 3 kind of big picture views of how cells change in space. At the top, you see that they change their shape. They go to be a sphere if they can at all. And just like the water bubbles that you see astronauts drinking go to a perfect sphere. In the lower left, in the blue, you see that they change the way they talk to each other. So those particles where they signal to one another change. And then on the right, you see another major change, which is all the genes that turn on and turn off change as those cells respond to this environment. And this gives an incredible experimental platform for understanding how gravity plays a role in cells. So as an example then of some of the ways that we use this, the National Institutes of Health partnered with CASIS, the Center for the Advancement of Science and Space, which manages our national laboratory, have 2 investigations that will be flying this year completely focused on improving our understanding of osteoporosis and bone loss back here on Earth. One of those is called NIH Osteo, and it is looking at 2 kinds of cells. There are cells that break up bone and cells that rebuild bone, because your bone is always being recycled. And an imbalance in those cells is what causes astronauts to lose bone in space. It's also what causes women with osteoporosis and some men with osteoporosis to get out of balance and start losing bone. And this NIH-funded investigation will be helping to understand the actual genes that are turning on and turning off, controlling the activity of these cells. So it's very important to understanding how to manage osteoporosis on Earth. Another NIH-funded investigation with CASIS is called Osteo4, and this is looking at the cells in the bone that actually sense mechanical forces. So your bones are sensing the forces on your body, both from exercising, from standing and fighting gravity, all of those forces. And this study will be looking at those cells that actually do the sensing. Right now, scientists do not understand how those cells get their signal and communicate it to the other cells. And so Osteo4 will be looking at that process. And finally, as one more example, there are a number of stem cell studies that will be flying in the coming year. CASIS, when they did a stem cell call, they had the largest response to any call for independently funded research on the space station that they've made to date, with hundreds of applicants. And some of their first studies from that call will be flying. And there will be a number of different stem cell studies. One of those, just as an example, is a Japanese study called Stem Cells that takes mouse stem cells. It flies them in space for a period of time. Then they bring them back home. They insert them into a mouse embryo, an 8-cell mouse embryo back on Earth. and then look at how the development of that embryo occurs over time. So this is really getting at understanding the basics of stem cells and developmental biology, which is a really interesting area as medicine tries to move towards helping people to rebuild their own organs when they have injuries. Shifting then from that small cellular level up to the level of the whole human, the one-year expedition as well as the 6-month crew members in the coming year are also really important. So this will be the first time that we've had astronauts on the space station for 12 months. It will also be the first time since the 1990s that we've had anyone in space for 12 months or more. And since the late 1990s, I think about all the changes in medicine that have happened. There have been major changes in our understanding of human physiology, also in human physiology in space. All the things that we've learned from the space station weren't known at that time. And we've got a genetic understanding of disease that is completely new from when the last cosmonauts flew for long periods of time in the 1990s. And that genetic connection, understanding how genes and environment interact, especially if that environment is something like being in space, is something completely new in the one-year expedition. And we have a unique opportunity that we're taking advantage of. Not only will we have a number of measures taken jointly on both Scott Kelly and Viktor Kornienko, but Scott has a twin brother, Mark Kelly. And so Mark will participate as a sort of a ground control to really help us understand this nature versus nurture question. And a group of 10 really premier scientists at looking at the genetic basis of disease and the genetic basis of many of the different processes that affect astronauts have partnered in this twin study to really make it a state-of-the-art investigation of that interaction between genes and the space environment in affecting the health of astronauts. If I could have the next graphic. For the past 15 years, we have really learned a lot about long-duration spaceflight. We've learned about the neurological system, the heart, bone, muscle, the immune system, nutrition effects, behavioral effects, and radiation effects. And all of those things kind of really affect the bodies of astronauts, and they push them towards something that looks not at all unlike aging on Earth, where their balance is disrupted, their hearts are weaker, their immune system isn't functioning as well, their muscles are weaker, and their bones are being lost. And yet, these are healthy people who otherwise would be probably some of the healthiest people back here on Earth for their age. And so we care about this both for future exploration, but also because of these potential Earth benefits from doing the research with the crew. Now, we know a lot about 6 months, but we know almost nothing about what happens between 6 and 12 months in space. And if I could have the next graphic, this is a highly simplified chart to kind of show you what we know about those effects on the body from 0 to 6 months, and which is that vertical line in the middle, and then from 6 to 12 months afterwards. Now, right now we know nothing about 6 to 12 months. So we see some things that have an early effect and then sort of stabilize. We see some things with a constant rate, either a high rate or a low rate. And we understand how to manage those risks, and we know which ones we need to work on before we'll be go for Mars. But what we don't know is if there are some processes that have a late effect. The yellow line in that chart, that late effect has things going up after 6 months, but not looking like a problem before that. And so this mission, even though it's only 2 crew members, it really gives us our first glimpse at what happens from 6 to 12 months and what risks are there that we don't know about today. And then that will help us both to design future research and also to identify those risks, and then to define the future one-year expeditions that we may need to do to make sure those risks have been taken care of and we're ready to go to Mars. A couple examples of investigations that we'll be doing. One investigation we'll be doing is called, 2 investigations really, fluid shifts and ocular health. And if I could have the video, I have some graphics that kind of illustrate that problem. So when astronauts go into space, this is a person on Earth where gravity is pulling the fluids in your body down towards your feet. And you have that normal fluid movement, that normal circulation. But when astronauts go into space, they don't have gravity pulling the fluids down anymore. And so you start getting a shift of fluids to the head. The crew members that we know well, we see their faces looking puffy, and we see their legs looking skinny, and chicken legs, we call it. Well, once you get those fluids shifting into the head, this is not without some impact. And we've learned this over just the last couple of years, that you also get an increase in the pressure in your brain called the intracranial pressure. And that fluid pressure pushes on the back of the eye, causes swelling of the optic nerve, and compresses the eyeball. Well, as you can imagine, the eyeball is a really sophisticated imaging device, and when you compress it, you're going to start getting impacts on vision. And so we see things like up to a 1.75 diopter shift in vision, and that's simulated there. It's basically high-powered reading glasses. We also, a few crew members have had things like cotton wool spots where certain parts of their retina have been damaged and they can't see as well there. But it doesn't happen to everybody. And so the vision ocular health study is really taking measurements to understand why it's happening in crew members, what the measurements are changing. And you saw Karen Nyberg there having a measurement taken on her eye. We also have a study to start understanding the real thing that's happening as the fluids move up and down in the body. And this will be the most complicated experiment we've ever done on ISS. And even more than that, we'll be doing it with a combination of US and Russian equipment in the Russian segment, with both Russian cosmonauts and astronauts participating as subjects and helping to set up and operate the experiment. So it's going to be a really exciting investigation. We will use the Russian Chibis, which is a lower body negative pressure device, to actually suck the fluids down into the crew members' legs, and then use our ultrasound and other equipment to make measurements on them and see what's happening with their blood vessels when what's happening with the fluid shifts. So this is going to be a really novel investigation and give us some insights we've never had before into this overall fluid shift and eye impacts problem. Another investigation that's part of the one-year increment is called field test. And this is not done on ISS, but it's done on the ground in Kazakhstan after the crew members return. And it's looking at the practical tasks that astronauts would have to do after a transit to Mars, things they would have to do right away when they land on Mars. So, you know, right now when we land in Kazakhstan, we've got a whole support network of people to help support the crew members. But that first crew going to Mars is going to be all by themselves. And so if I could have the next video, I'll show you just some examples of the kinds of tasks. One thing that crew members would have to do is get out of their seats or get out of the protection that they've been in for a pretty rough landing. And they'll have to be able to jump out of a vehicle, perhaps, you know, jumping down some stairs. They might need to move some things around. We call that rock translation with these different barbells. And so as you can imagine, when crew members come back, they have dizziness. They have what we call orthostatic intolerance, which means a tendency to want to faint because they're not used to having fluids back down in their feet and out of their head. And here's some construction activities. You might need to connect some valves together, have everything ready to go to protect your life support system. You know, screwing things together, bolting things together, connecting tubes, and using some tools. And the crew members may have to do this when they're relatively dizzy, possibly not feeling well. Their muscles may be weakened, their bones may be weakened. They've just been on a transit in a very small compartment before they start doing these things. They may need to open hatches, and so you can see a torque generation activity and other things that the crew members will have to do while their whole sensory system adjusts to being in 3/5 gravity, wearing heavy suits, and really doing things quite differently. And the final one I wanted to show you was a ladder climb test, where the crews might need to climb into a vehicle or out of a vehicle or into a habitat. So this is helping us, and it's done completely jointly with our Russian colleagues, and these are only a few of the types of measures that are made. This is helping us to really work internationally to understand how the crew members could carry out the tasks that need to be done on Mars, and it really helps us prepare for a joint investigation. But also, if you look at these tasks, these kinds of tasks are things that patients on Earth who have, say, had a stroke or recovering from some kind of injury also need to do. We see patients in occupational therapy. So what we learn from this is in someone who hasn't had a brain injury, how can we retrain people who've lost the ability to do some of these things to do them well? And are there things we can do even in the transit as we go to Mars to help prevent some of these impacts? So even though we're focused on exploration and defining some of these tasks, they also really benefit us back here on Earth. So just to wrap up, we'll have between 400 and 500 investigations on ISS in the coming year, about 300 in any 6-month period, and many joint investigations with our Russian colleagues, a level of collaboration across the whole ISS partnership of all 16 nations that is higher than we've ever seen before. And we're of course, also having the astrophysics, the physical sciences, all kinds of things that I didn't talk about today. But I think this theme on human health, both of crews and of health back here on Earth, is a really important one. And now I'll hand it off to Steve to tell you a little bit about the health of the actual crew.
Thank you. Appreciate the opportunity to talk this morning. And I would add to my colleagues' comments about the importance of this mission. It'll provide us critical experience for planned future operations so that hopefully one day we can ask a crew member to stay for 2 years in space or 3 years in space, depending on what the missions call for. From the medical perspective, the crew, we start being involved with the crew about 2 years prior to their launch. And I had some activities with Scott earlier this morning, and I think nobody's happier than the crew to find out that he only has like 5 activities left before he launches. When you look at the total program of that 2-year time period, there's about 40 hours of, the equivalent of 40 hours of testing that we do. And any body system you could think of, we have testing that we are interested in doing for that. And so we have a few more activities before launch, and then as the science program, we'll be maintaining a comprehensive set of investigations during the flight to have a sense for how Scott's doing, how his body systems are changing, and eventually his preparedness for return to Earth. The additional comment I would make is, as was talked about in the science program, we have a unique opportunity on this mission because Scott has a twin to look very closely at the changes that the space environment provide while studying his brother who's staying on the ground while Scott's in space. And I don't have any other comments at this point. The crew are doing well and looking forward to the mission, and we're excited to be participating in this. So.
All right, thanks, Steve, and thanks for everybody for your opening statements. Now time for questions. We're going to start off. Anybody here in the room that has a question, then we'll go to our phone bridge, and then we'll take some of our questions that we're getting in from social media. So just like I read, I'm going to go left to right. So if you would raise your hand, and again, please state your name, affiliation. Eric? Go ahead.
Eric Berger with Houston Chronicle. A question for Mike, and then a question probably for maybe for Julie. So Mars is a multi-year mission. Obviously, some of it in space, some of it on the ground. Do you have any plans, or would it be possible to do an 18-year or a 2-year mission on the ISS? Have you thought about that or talked about that?
We have not talked about it. We certainly could. This is sort of a stepwise approach. There's a number of things you use station for, and this is one of them, of course, is to study the human adaptation to a microgravity environment and the entire environment that space is relative to living here on Earth. So I think the first step of doing 1-year missions to kind of see where that knee in the curve is, like Julie talked about, is very important. And I think that's the way we'll handle it. We'll look to see what happens in a year if we get indications that things are changing or we're unstable and we need to spend more time on orbit. Then I suspect that we'll have a conversation about extending that a little bit. So from a station standpoint, there's really no limitation. We can have a limited set of the crew stay for an extended period of time. We could have the entire crew stay for an extended period of time if we thought that was appropriate. Again, the system doesn't really prevent that. There's limitations on the transportation spacecraft for the crew that we'd have to replace every so often, and we've done that in the past, so that's not a big deal, and it's just about having the logistics on orbit for the crew to perform. So there really is no limitation on the station to keep us from extending the crew's time even longer on orbit, but we have not really discussed that with the partnership at this point.
The second part would be, what kind of data did Roscosmos collect in the 1990s on their 1-year missions or their 438-day missions? Is it useful? Have they shared it with you as part of the partnership? And in terms of sort of, I mean, are we, with the tools and sensors and computers, are we able to get like 10 times as much data, or just sort of how much more useful is it going to be to sort of be doing this now versus what was collected maybe 15 or 20 years ago?
Yeah, so Roscosmos has shared both some of the unpublished data with us. They've also published several volumes of data from Mir that explain the data that they've observed in terms of deconditioning and so forth. At the time, the standard would be making fairly observational measurements about, how well the crew was able to exercise, how strong they were when they returned to Earth. So they're very basic kinds of measures that are in that data. So they're useful, but they're very basic, and there's only a handful of data points or a handful of crew members with that data. So what we're seeing now is we're working with them to look at everything we know from 6 months and where we should go from there. So for example, neither NASA nor Roscosmos knew back in those days that there would be eye impacts. The stuff I talked about with vision has been discovered just in the last 3 years, only when you had a large number of crew members doing long duration missions. Another example is, I think, from Mir data, because of the exercise hardware they had, we mostly thought, and our Russian colleagues mostly thought that running on a treadmill was the most important thing to do. And it is certainly important for cardiovascular, for maintaining your cardiovascular fitness. But what we found on ISS is that intensive resistive exercise is what really helps to protect bone. So all of that knowledge is going into these joint investigations. I think there are about 15 different investigations that we're collaborating with our Russian colleagues on, exchanging data, and even comparing investigations that we've been doing on 6 months with investigations they've been doing on 6-month crew, putting that all together with 12 months of data, and then being able to compare 6 months versus 12 months. And so that makes, even though we only have 2 crew members, it makes it much more powerful when they do the same investigations that we have really strong data on for many crew members in 6 months.
Bill Harwood, CBS News for Stephen. Can you give us a sense of what Scott Kelly will experience on a weekly basis? What sort of data would you be collecting every day? What stuff is every week or every month? Or how does that, just a sense of what he's going to have to do to collect the data that you guys are looking for?
Well, it's a good question. On a weekly basis, Scott will have a science program that's being implemented, and so those activities typically have to occur at identified times during the flight. The other things that he'll do for us is we have a weekly medical conference with him, and just to kind of get a sense for how he's doing in that regard. And many of our activities from the medical system side are geared towards a monthly type evaluation. For example, we would check his exercise capacity, that type of thing. The other thing that the crew are doing on a daily, they're doing things on a daily basis to help maintain their health status, and primarily that's the exercise system. They have approximately 2 to 2.5 hours a day to do exercise, and so we use a suite of activities to monitor the crew. We do a little bit of telemedicine to kind of keep their status, and then there's a lot of one of the things as a follow-on to the previous question is we now have on board, in contrast to Mir, we have a lot more sophisticated imaging capability. So we have ultrasounds, complicated gear to get very detailed images of the back of the eyes, for example, and so those things will be done on a regular basis so that we can monitor any changes throughout the flight.
And just a quick follow, is there any changes to his projected exercise regimen over a year? Or is it pretty much the same thing throughout, depending on how it goes?
The short answer is we're planning to do something akin to what they would do during a 6-month mission. So what the ACERs or the trainers recommend for the crew is they'll generally put them through a few plateaus, basically. So you peak them up and let them relax a little bit, and peak them back up and let them relax a bit. And you're trying to get them to their fitness level. Ideally, you try to get them to their fitness level at the time that they launched. So.
Thanks.
Hi, Robert Perlin with CollectSpace.com with a question and follow-up. For Mike, from a program perspective, in terms of supporting a 6-member crew on station, are there any significant differences to keeping 2 people, the same 2 people on board for a full year versus swapping them out 6 months? Is there any specific challenges for a 1-year mission?
Really, there's not. The biggest challenge when you rotate crews differently is to sort out how you're going to do that. And you can kind of see that on what we call the A line, where we fly 2 Russians and 1 U.S. crew member on the Soyuz flight. And you can see about halfway through the one-year mission, they're going to rotate the Soyuz and rotate commanders. So all that had to be worked out, and now we end up with a taxi flight, and there's the decisions on who's going to fly on that flight and how you're going to deal with the taxi crew members. But the operation of the station, the logistics, the science, all that is it's the same thing we kind of do on a regular basis.
And Julie mentioned that this is a peak for joint operations between Russia and the United States. We're going on the 15th anniversary of human continuous occupancy of the station. There's been cosmonauts and astronauts on board all that time. Why is it taken till now to this mission to encourage increased joint cooperation on science activities on the station?
Well, that's an excellent question. So from a research perspective, we have been collaborating with the partners for many, many years, even well before the International Space Station program. And as such, if you look across the rest of the partners other than Russians, you'll see a fairly large collaboration in research. Our Russian colleagues came in later, and so it's taken us some time to get familiar with each other, what we do, how we handle our research, how we choose research, how we do our research on orbit, how do you share the research when you're done. And so it's taken up to about this period. It's been a slow, methodical process of trying to get comfortable enough with how each side does certain types of research and how you might collaborate till we've come to this point, and honestly kind of used it as a forcing function to say, okay, we can't really have everybody using the crews separately, particularly when we have two crew members, one's Russian and one's U.S. crew member. And the way we do research today, or often up until this point, is a lot of the Russian research was done on Russian crew members, a lot of the U.S. research was done on U.S. crew members, but now we only have two crew members, and we wanted to make sure that they were treated as identically as possible so we can all use two data points instead of each of us use a single data point. And so that kind of forced the whole system to collaborate on this research. And it really has set the processes in place for us to do future collaborations. So it's been beneficial for us. Of course, as you can imagine, it takes time. This has been a 2-year process of how will we collaborate. It was a criteria to agreeing to do this, that since the two crew members were from different countries, we had to share the data and we had to collaborate. And so it became our forcing function. So over the last couple of years, we have collaborated on this and started to work towards other areas where we can collaborate. And also fix the process. Fix is the wrong word. The best way to collaborate is at the early stages of selecting the research you're going to go do. That's where you really figure out where the PIs are and how they're going to work together. And so this is probably the most difficult step of collaborating on, or truly collaborating on orbit, the way we do today with some of the other partners. And so that's being looked at today because of what we've been through with this 1-year increment. So I tell you, it takes time to really get to know each other enough to figure out how to collaborate, and then it takes sort of a forcing function. And so we're in a different place with our Russian partners than we are with our European partners, but now we're starting to get there.
All right, Mark. Thank you, Mark Carreau, for Aviation Week. I have a couple of questions for Mike Seferdini. As I listen to the agenda of activities, it seems very ambitious for the next year, as you said. So how crucial is it that the commercial cargo providers provide on time?
You're talking about specifically for the logistics providers,
yeah,
as opposed to the configuration?
I mean, a lot of people are involved on the ground in space. You've got to move stuff back and forth, and I'm just trying to get a sense of how crucial you perceive it to be that they can show up and bring stuff back and all the other stuff that makes it work.
Well, it's the logistics guys are the key to us being able to do what we do on orbit. I mean, it's fundamentally that's the case. So you can talk about when providers might show up, and if they slip a little bit, you can talk about which providers. As we know, SpaceX brings back recoverable down mass, a significant amount of recoverable condition down mass, which is significant. So you could talk about whether that's there or slipping or not. But it's just crucial. We can't operate without the logistics partners. So with the orbital stand down for a bit, we've basically lost 2.3 metric tons of cargo that we had planned for. So now we're adjusting for that, which we can do. That's not a huge issue because of how we protect ourselves on orbit with the gap that we protect for. And then as I mentioned when we talked about the SpaceX 5, we've made some adjustments in that manifest, and we're protecting really closer to 4 months gap on orbit instead of 6. So we've made some adjustments so it's not as big a deal from a research impact, although it has, and then we're trying to pull these other flights up. We're doing all that because we need to do it that way in order to continue to have a robust research plan and to get all of the other things we need to get done. Of course, there's quite a bit of upmass for the reconfiguration that we have to go do. That has to show up, and it's not all on orbit today. Some of it has to come up here in the next few months to get the reconfiguration. Certainly the docking adapter itself has to come up on SpaceX 7. So, you know, it's critical. I mean, we can't live without it. So we're working very closely with SpaceX to fly as close to the times that we have on our manifest today. Of course, they agree to the manifest, but things happen, and you know, there's a lot of other vehicles flying. And so they're very attentive to that and working very closely with us to try to keep their schedule. They're looking at these flights later in the year to see how much we might be able to pull them up. And then our job is to maintain the flexibility so that when they move a little bit, it's not a huge impact to us. But they do need to show up for sure. And if they move to the right a little bit, then we'll be okay.
And if I could follow up, could you just touch on Loop B cooling and where that's going at this point?
Yeah, since I spent most of my life yesterday on that, I probably could touch on a little bit. Of course, Emily does this 24 hours a day. I just visit every so often when things get interesting. So of course, there was not an ammonia leak. We have recovered cooling inside and reconfigured the systems. Largely, they're all back up and running. But there's a significant challenge when you bring up the ammonia system outside because you can freeze the heat exchangers. There's water on one side of the heat exchanger, ammonia on the other. So just the phase of the ammonia alone can put you in a case where you end up with bubbles and then you end up freezing water in the heat exchangers. And so it's been an interesting experience for us. Since we've flown space stations, we've kind of learned how difficult this can be and how you protect for it. So it takes time to get the conditions right on both sides of the heat exchanger, each of the heat exchangers, more than one, to make sure that as we introduce ammonia, the ammonia is at the right temperature such it won't freeze water on the other side. And you have to do that not only for one heat exchanger, you've got to do it for all the heat exchangers in that loop. So we're not really pushed for time. We got plenty of cooling on the A side, and the systems are doing fine. So we've asked the team to be very methodical and bring the loops on when you're ready. Of course, to add a little interest to our lives, late yesterday we had an MDM go down that gives us insight into the Loop B, some of the Loop B systems. We recovered that MDM, and it turned out it had an error counter on it that was counting up. And we found, I guess we got it recovered and it was going fine, and we noticed this morning the error counter now has started counting up again, which means eventually it's going to run into this ADA issue. So that just to add interest, the team is now calculating when the error counter will time out, and then we're trying to plan our ops around when the counter will time out so that we can recover the MDM. So that's just to add interest. So it'll take us a little bit of time, and we're doing that on purpose. If the A side went down, we'd suddenly do it a lot quicker. And we've actually been working on this specific case for the last year. We kind of got sensitized to it last time we went through a pump change out. So the team's done quite a bit of work. I would tell you we're just being conservative to make sure that everything is going to be fine and that we find the right conditions to introduce the ammonia and keep us from freezing the heat exchangers. So that's where we are. Again, if the A side went down, we could probably get the B side back a little quicker than we're doing now, but we just want to be very, very careful since we have the time.
And sorry, Mark, let's keep it to one and a follow-up for right now. If we have time at the end, we'll come back for final questions. Jim, I think you have one.
For Julia, Jim Oberg with Spectrum Magazine. You gave a good explanation of why two sample sets are good, but 10 are better. And the answer would be, the question would be, you've discussed future reflights, maybe of the 12-month, but without a commitment. Is there any preliminary planning and any preliminary hopes for when you would send your second 12-month expedition up?
Well, of course, scientifically, we know that 2 isn't enough. But what we don't know right now is what that 6 to 12-month period looks like. So we're really, we're talking about it scientifically, but we're not really having deep discussions about it until we have the first information from the first 2. If we see something dramatic, that's going to change how everybody looks at having additional one-year missions. If we don't see anything dramatic, then that might be less important. And until we know that with these first 2 subjects, it doesn't really make sense to draw a line in the sand.
And a follow-up on that, because you're looking for unknown unknowns, which is true exploration, what particular instrumentation and measurements are you making that you really don't know what you're going to see? What kind of things are you looking at that have so far given no indications, but in your intuition, your team's intuition, do you suspect, or worry you? But what are some things that might happen that, and again, speculation, I'm not asking for predictions.
Yeah, so we have a pretty clean list of all the different physiological systems that could be impacted. And we have the same types of studies that we've done with the 6-month cruise, we're doing with the 1-year cruise to make sure we've checked kind of all those major systems. Then we have the support of the medical monitoring to go behind it so that if that also would detect something that maybe we didn't have an experiment focused on. And so between those 2 things, some measurements, we don't know what the eye looks like between 6 and 12 months at all. So that is a completely novel measurement. We don't know, we've never put the ultrasound together with the Chibis in this kind of way. So we have no idea what those fluid shifts look like. These are really novel observations. And then probably the most important novel observation is we've never done genomic studies in humans on ISS. So we've never done something like the twin study where we looked at, where we sequenced the genes of both Scott and Mark, and then we look at the gene expression, we look at different markers, so that on ISS it just looks like blood sampling, but what you do when you get those samples home is brand new. We've never had data like that before.
Yes.
And that list you
Sorry,
have,
Jim, again, just one question for now and one follow-up. So.
no problem.
Hi, I'm Stacy Glazeman with Houston Community Newspapers. A question for Dr. Gilmore. When obviously the twin brothers are in the study, with Mark Kelly being the control, is he training alongside his brother with the same type of physical training so that they're in the same physical condition?
I don't believe that they're following the same exercise programs, no. But maybe Julie can speak a little bit more. They are going through very similar data collection programs for the payloads that are involved. So.
Yeah, participating in the same exercise regime doesn't really make sense because they're, a major part of the exercise you're doing every day is just fighting gravity to stand up and to sit. So that wasn't, the scientists don't think that that's a necessary kind of a control. Of course, Mark is a fit person and he intends to stay fit, so he's going to continue the things that he does, and Scott's going to do the prescriptions that he has as well as his ground research now.
Thank you.
Any more questions here in the room?
Johnny Severson, CEO of Real Space Education. I know a lot of preparations are made for the astronauts when they're going up. While they're there, are there any new preparations that are being made for this 1-year mission upon his return?
Probably the biggest difference on return are going to be some of these things like field tests that I talked about that will be more extensive kinds of ground measurements of how they perform in those tasks. So we've been doing something we call mini field tests for the last few 6-month crew members to start getting used to doing those kinds of complex operations in the tent, in the medical tent in Kazakhstan. That was a pretty new innovation, and we got started on that a little early to make sure we could do it. But the 1-year field test measurements are going to be more extensive than anything we've done with the 6-month crew members. The other thing that we will be doing, because they're participating in these joint studies, we have to do some pretty tricky things to make sure that all the ground measurements, even if when they're no longer together, are also taken in parallel. So there's some things like that on the ground that we have to keep a good eye on so that the data post-flight is equivalent for the 2 crew.
Okay, any more in here inside the room? No? Okay, we'll go ahead and go to our phone bridge then. Please wait until I call your name. I'll start off with Marion Crane from Space.com.
Hi, thanks so much for taking my question. I'm wondering, this question is for Dr. Robinson. So is there any kind of science that doesn't involve human health or human physiology research that you're able to do during the 1-year mission that maybe you wouldn't be able to do during a 6-month? Thanks.
Yeah, so other than the studies using the crew as subjects in 1 year, everything else we could have done with 6-month crew or 1-year crew. So the only subtle difference is that we have Scott and Victor up for a whole year, so we don't have to train them twice. Once they know how to do something, they can continue doing it. So actually, I personally predict, especially knowing folks like Scott really well, that they're going to be more efficient at doing tasks as they get on through. You know, we have some investigations that require operations for the full year, and I have a feeling by the time they're doing it in month 8 or 9, they're going to be probably better than any 6-month crew member ever was at doing that task, just because they'll have repetition. But overall, it's just the duration of the 1-year crew really makes them valuable subjects. That's the primary scientific difference.
Okay, thank you, Marion. Let's go next to Marcia Dunn with the Associated Press.
Yes, hi. I'm wondering what personality trait, what personality traits does Scott Kelly bring to the 1-year mission that makes him particularly well suited for being on orbit an entire year? And as you consider more 1-year crews, what's your take on what the ideal person might be for such a long flight?
I'll take a swipe at that, I guess. One of the things, you know, there's a lot of factors that go into the crew selection, and I think some of the things that are that Scott exemplifies is he's fairly adaptable, and that's something that's important. You got to be able to roll with whatever comes your way during a longer mission like this. And the other thing, I had the opportunity to work with him during his previous 6-month mission, and I think all of us know Scott pretty well. But one of the good things that he does is he's fairly direct. He's not bashful about telling you what, or talking about what needs to be done to improve things and things like that. And that's also a really valuable trait.
Yeah, some of our previous behavioral health studies have shown that you can have challenges in communication between the crew and the ground as the crew becomes stressed out. And so one of the things with Scott is, of course, that he is very open. He's very ready to say what he thinks and so forth. And so he's probably less likely to have that tendency not to communicate with the ground if he gets frustrated. But what's interesting is he'll also be participating, he and Victor will both be participating again in a repeat of that study that had those results for 6-month crew members. So we'll get the opportunity to understand from several different studies, from a study looking at their reporting of how they're feeling and whether they're having senses of isolation and confinement. There'll be some studies on their performance over time. And then there'll be these studies on the way that they interact with the ground. And all of those different studies will come together to help us get a better sense of that after his flight's over as well.
Okay, next up we have Amy Thompson, Spaceflight Insider. Amy, are you there?
Yes. My question.
Amy, you're very low. Can you speak up?
Oh, Yes, actually my question's been answered. Thank you.
Okay. We'll go ahead and move on then. Next we have Carrie Sheridan with AFP.
Thank you. My question's already been answered too. Thanks.
All right, we're knocking them out then. So finally on our phone bridge, we have Irene Klotz with Reuters.
Thanks very much. For Mike Seppardini, when is the earliest that ISS is going to be ready to support commercial crew vehicles for even test flights? And also, when is NASA now planning to add a seventh crew member to the ISS missions?
You get all that?
Yes, I think I did. So Irene, our plan is to be able to allow a vehicle to dock to the International Space Station by the end of calendar year 2015. I'm sorry, yeah, 2015. The thought process is that the commercial providers will probably bring at least a test vehicle to ISS in the 2017 timeframe. And we wanted some time to make sure that we had the system checked out and ready to go. So we're shooting for the end of 2015, at least to have one port active and the comm system ready to support all that. So that's what we're shooting for. Today, the manifest calls for the commercial vehicles to start bringing increment crews to the International Space Station in 2018. And at that point, the vehicle will bring a 4 crew member up when it comes. So that's the point at which we'll step up to 1 additional crew member on the International Space Station.
Okay, that'll do it for our phone bridge. Next we have Meg Sumner, one of our public affairs officers. She's been collecting some questions from social media. Meg, why don't you go ahead and give us one?
Yeah, we have one from Twitter from Laura Keeney. My question for NASA is, why 2 male crew members for the ISS 1-year mission? Physiological effects of space are different on men and women.
So let me take that just scientifically. So there was no bias in the selection of the crew members. It was equally possible for a woman to have been selected when we did the 1-year crew selection. It just so happened that this was the crew member that was selected. What's really interesting is when we look at the radiation models for the lifetime effects and the cancer risks on crew members, women are much more susceptible. They have much higher risk of impacts from living in the radiation environment. And so that does affect the ability of women to do longer duration missions. It also affects the ability of women sometimes to do repeat missions over time. So one of the things that I think is really important for gender equity in space exploration is actually to get good countermeasures for some of these radiation effects. And that's something that we're not primarily doing on ISS. We're primarily doing that in ground-based research, but it's a very important area of work.
Also from Sarah Geertsen on Twitter, what resources are available for medical or emotional needs on board during the year-long journey?
Well, the crew has access to a number of things, and probably the most important ones are they have effectively the ability to use a telephone and call friends, family, whoever they'd like to call. Email is also available. And then there's a certain number of crew special activities where they can have an interaction with various guests that they select on the ground. And then we also do a couple more things. One of them is they have a family conference on a weekly basis, and then we also, from the sort of the medical side, we sort of have the medical team that has some conferences with the crew just to kind of see how things are going. So there's a lot of opportunity there.
Yeah, I'd add is on systems on board, we've worked very hard to give crew members almost as much access to communicate on orbit as they do on the ground. So they have internet access as well. As Steve mentioned, we have the IP phone that's available to them. Whenever we have KU access, which is a lion's share of the orbits, we have KU access. We give the crews access to movies. In fact, sometimes we've got them movies that are released to theaters before they release to theaters. I think in one case we did that. We are, in fact, through special requests, we are looking to get a bigger screen on orbit so the crews can have a better view of a movie during a movie night, whenever it is. So we're taking a lot of steps to make sure the crews have access to communicate, but also kind of the normalcy of home. So, you know, we get them football games, or they want football games. So all these kinds of things are steps we take to try to make them feel like they're still, you know, attached to life here on Earth, so that they can feel as normal as they can given the environment they're in.
Okay, thanks, Meg. We're just about out of time. Are there any really quick follow-ups? No? Okay. Then that will go ahead and bring us to a close. Again, this is our briefing looking at the launch of Expedition 43 and the one-year crew. As always, you can follow along for the science on Twitter at ISS_research. And you can follow Scott Kelly on his journey at Station CDR Kelly. And as always, you can follow the hashtag ISS1year, and get all the latest on our website at nasa.gov/station. Thank you for joining us this morning. Have a good rest of the day.